Imagine a day when the fate of all Western civilization hung in the waves of the Mediterranean. A day when the greatest empire in the known world sent its invincible fleet to crush Christian resistance once and for all. A day when a revolutionary weapon would forever change the face of naval warfare. This is the account of the Battle of Lepanto, fought on October 7th, 1571, and of the secret weapon that decided the fate of millions. Welcome to History Files, where we uncover the forgotten stories that shaped our world. On that October morning, over 500 warships gathered in the Gulf of Patras, near the coast of Greece. More than 160,000 men prepared for battle. It would be the largest naval engagement since antiquity, and the last great galley battle in history. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power, commanded 300 galleys manned by the most feared warriors in the Mediterranean. Facing them stood the Holy League, an unlikely alliance of Christian states who had set aside centuries of rivalry to confront an existential threat. But hidden within the Christian fleet was something the Ottomans had never encountered before, a weapon so revolutionary that it would shatter their invincible reputation in a single afternoon, a weapon that would transform naval warfare forever. Today, you'll discover exactly what that weapon was, how it worked, and why it proved so devastatingly effective against an empire that had conquered half the known world. This is the story of Lepanto, the day innovation defeated tradition, the day 6 strange vessels changed the course of history. To understand the secret weapon at Lepanto, we must first understand what it faced. The Ottoman Empire of 1571 was the most powerful military force on earth. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II had conquered Constantinople, ending 1,000 years of Byzantine history. From that moment, Ottoman expansion seemed unstoppable. Their armies marched across Eastern Europe, conquered Hungary, besieged Vienna. They dominated North Africa, from Egypt to Morocco, and they transformed the Mediterranean into what Europeans fearfully called a Turkish lake. The Ottoman fleet was the embodiment of maritime terror. Their galleys, long, narrow vessels propelled primarily by oars, glided through the waters with terrifying speed. Each galley carried up to 300 oarsmen, many of them Christian slaves captured in previous battles, condemned to a brutal existence chained to the rowing benches. Above them, elite soldiers known as janissaries prepared for hand-to-hand combat. These were the Sultan's finest troops, taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be ultimate warriors. Ottoman naval tactics had been perfected over generations. Their galleys would surge toward the enemy using hundreds of synchronized oars. Upon impact, a bronze ram would pierce the enemy's hull, while grappling hooks locked the vessels together. Then janissaries armed with scimitars, bows, and arquebus would swarm the enemy decks in relentless waves. It was essentially infantry combat on floating platforms. And at this, the Ottomans were masters. Few forces could withstand their assault. By 1571, Sultan Selim II ruled an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to Vienna's gates. His arsenals in Istanbul could construct complete galleys in days. His trade routes connected 3 continents, bringing unimaginable wealth. Meanwhile, Christian Europe was deeply divided. The Protestant Reformation had shattered unity. Catholics and Protestants sometimes seemed to hate each other more than they feared the Ottoman advance. France, though Catholic, allied with the Ottomans to weaken Habsburg rivals. Only a few powers remained vigilant. Philip II of Spain understood his Mediterranean empire was at stake. The Republic of Venice saw its trade routes being strangled. Pope Pius V recognized that Rome itself could be threatened. The trigger came in 1570 with the Ottoman assault on Cyprus. The island had been Venetian for nearly a century. The siege of Famagusta lasted over a year. When the city finally fell in August 1571, the Ottoman commander promised the Venetian leader Marcantonio Bragadin safe conduct. It was a lie. Bragadin was subjected to unspeakable torture. His ears and nose were cut off. Then, in an act that shocked all of Europe, he was flayed alive. His skin peeled from his body while he still lived. His skin was stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy in Istanbul. This atrocity galvanized Christian Europe. Pope Pius V, a man of iron determination, worked tirelessly to forge an alliance that seemed impossible. He needed to unite Venice, which had lost Cyprus and demanded revenge, with Spain, which viewed Venice as a commercial competitor. He needed to include the Papal States, Genoa, Savoy, Malta, and smaller powers, each with their own agendas and mutual distrust. Through skillful diplomacy, fervent religious appeals, and promises of material benefits, the Pope achieved what many considered impossible. In May 1571, the Holy League was born, a coalition of Christian states committed to halting Ottoman expansion. To command this unlikely alliance, a young man was chosen who would become legend. Don Juan of Austria was only 24 years old, the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V and half-brother to King Philip II of Spain. Don Juan had proven his military worth suppressing the Moorish rebellion in Granada. He was charismatic, handsome, cultured, and ambitious. Some said he dreamed of conquering Constantinople itself. What no one questioned was his courage and determination. The Holy League fleet began assembling in Messina, Sicily, during summer 1571. It was an impressive logistical feat. Ships arrived from across the western Mediterranean. Venetian galleys painted in the Republic's colors, Spanish galleons, vessels from Genoa, the Papal States, Malta, and among these ships was something new. Something most veteran commanders viewed with profound skepticism. These were the galiasses, vessels that represented a radical evolution. While traditional galleys were low, narrow, and relied on speed and maneuverability, galiasses were monsters of the sea. They were larger, over 40 meters long, taller, with imposing forecastles and sterncastles rising 4 decks high, and they carried artillery that would have been impossible on a regular galley. The Venetians, always the Mediterranean's most daring naval innovators, had developed this concept through decades of experimentation. A galleass's hull was reinforced to withstand the weight and recoil of dozens of cannons. At the bow, it mounted heavy artillery pieces capable of firing projectiles weighing 20 kilograms or more at considerable distances. Along the sides, rows of smaller cannons created a devastating field of fire. Some galiasses carried 50 or more guns of various sizes. But the true revolution wasn't just the number of cannons. It was the combat philosophy they represented. For centuries, Mediterranean naval warfare had been essentially infantry battles on floating platforms. The objective was to get close, board the enemy vessel, and fight hand-to-hand. Artillery existed, but it was support for the boarding maneuver, not the decisive weapon. Galiasses proposed something radically different: destroy the enemy from a distance before they could even board. This idea met considerable resistance. Veteran commanders who had spent decades perfecting galley warfare viewed galiasses as clumsy aberrations. They were slow, difficult to maneuver, dependent on wind for movement. Critics called them floating fortresses, impressive to look at but impractical in battle. Some argue they would be sitting ducks, too big to hide, too slow to escape. Don Juan of Austria, however, saw something different. He recognized that while galiasses couldn't pursue enemies, they could form anchor points in a battle line, creating impossible kill zones for any galley attempting to advance. He decided to incorporate 6 Venetian galiasses into his battle formation. It was a decision that would prove absolutely crucial. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha commanded nearly 300 galleys filled with veteran warriors. He had received direct orders from the Sultan: destroy the Christian fleet once and for all. Ottoman confidence bordered on arrogance. They had defeated Christian fleets repeatedly over previous decades. Their recent victory in Cyprus had been complete. They believed the Holy League fleet would simply be another conquest added to their long list. Some Ottoman commanders were already discussing what they would do after victory: which Italian cities to sack first, how much territory to incorporate into the empire. In September 1571, the Holy League fleet finally set sail from Messina. It was a spectacular sight. More than 200 galleys and galleons sailed in formation, their colorful sails creating a carpet over the blue Mediterranean. Religious banners fluttered from every mast. Golden crosses gleamed in the sun. Aboard these vessels traveled over 80,000 men, including some of Europe's fiercest soldiers. Among them was a young Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes, the future author of Don Quixote. He was sick with fever but refused to remain below deck, insisting on fighting. His courage would cost him dearly. He would receive 3 arquebus wounds, one permanently paralyzing his left hand. But he would survive to write about that glorious day. The fleet sailed east across the Adriatic, searching for the Ottoman fleet. Then, on the morning of October 7th, as the Christian fleet sailed near the western coast of Greece, observers atop the masts shouted the warning everyone had both expected and feared. Sails on the horizon. Many sails. The Ottoman fleet had been found. The confrontation that would decide the Mediterranean's fate was about to begin. The two fleets sighted each other at dawn near the mouth of the Gulf of Patras, close to the city of Lepanto. The scenery was dramatic. Mountains of Greece rising to the north. The sea relatively calm, with only a gentle western breeze. Don Juan immediately summoned his commanders for final council. Tension filled the air. Venetian and Spanish commanders still harbored mutual distrust despite their alliance. The battle formation was carefully planned. The Christian fleet would organize into 3 main divisions, extending in a line about 3 miles wide. Don Juan would personally command the center division aboard the Real, a magnificent galley adorned with gold and crimson silk. To his right, commanding the southern wing, would be Giovanni Andrea Doria, one of the fleet's most experienced admirals. To his left, commanding the northern wing, would be Agostino Barbarigo, a Venetian admiral determined to avenge Cyprus. And then came the crucial decision about the galiasses. Don Juan positioned these 6 vessels at the head of the Christian battle line, 2 opposite each division. They would serve as a first line of defense, absorbing and disrupting the initial Ottoman attack. It was risky. If the galiasses failed to slow the enemy advance, they would simply become obstacles for the Christian fleet itself. But if they performed as planned, they could break the Ottoman momentum before it even began. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha organized his fleet into 3 divisions. He held considerable numerical advantage, some 300 galleys against approximately 280 Christian vessels. His strategy was classic: advance quickly, use numerical superiority to envelop the Christian wings, then converge on the center in a devastating pincer movement. Commanding the Ottoman right wing was Mem Sirocco, who knew Greek waters intimately. Commanding the left wing was Ulik Ali, an Italian renegade who had converted to Islam and become one of the Mediterranean's most feared corsairs. By noon, both fleets were ready. Don Juan, in a gesture that would become legendary, ordered a large crucifix erected on his galley's mast. He then traveled the fleet in a small boat, visiting each division, speaking to commanders and common soldiers, inspiring them with words of encouragement. He told them they fought not merely for glory or plunder, but for the freedom of their families, the safety of their homes, and the preservation of their faith. On the Ottoman side, Ali Pasha issued his own exhortations, reminding his men of countless victories, of Christian weakness and division, of the inevitability of their triumph. The Janissaries beat their weapons against their shields in a deafening rhythm that seemed to make the sea itself vibrate. Then, around 12:30 in the afternoon, the order was given. The Ottoman galleys began to advance, their oars striking the water in perfect synchrony. It was a sight simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Hundreds of vessels moving as a single organism, their sharp prows cutting through waves, their green banners fluttering. The sound was deafening. The beating of drums, the shouts of rowers, the creaking of wood under extreme strain. The Christian fleet remained in formation, waiting. This was the most difficult part, the moment of uncertainty before contact, when each man was alone with his thoughts and fears. And then, when the Ottoman galleys reached about 1,000 meters from the Christian line, the galiasses opened fire. The effect was devastating and completely unexpected for the Ottomans. The heavy cannons mounted on the galiasses' bows fired almost simultaneously, creating a wall of fire and smoke. 20-kilogram iron balls flew through the air at terrifying speeds, striking the Ottoman galleys leading the attack. What followed was carnage. A cannonball striking a galley packed with men didn't just pierce the hull. It continued its trajectory through entire ranks of soldiers and oarsmen, turning flesh and bone into red mist. Splinters of wood became secondary projectiles, as deadly as the shot itself. Oars were ripped away, throwing operators overboard or crushing them. Within minutes, several Ottoman galleys in the vanguard were transformed into floating wreckage. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. The Ottomans had expected a traditional battle. They had planned to quickly approach, board, and win through superior hand-to-hand combat. No one had prepared for this kind of concentrated artillery fire. The galleys at the front attempted to evade, creating confusion in ranks behind them. The Ottoman formation, which should have been a powerful lance piercing the Christian center, began to fragment even before actual fighting began. But the Ottomans were seasoned warriors. They regrouped and continued their advance, their galleys accelerating, trying to get past the galiasses before they could reload. It was a desperate race, and many succeeded. The galiasses, for all their firepower, were slow to reload. Dozens of Ottoman galleys passed them and crashed into the main Christian line. The clash was titanic. Wood collided with wood with a crash heard for miles. Rams pierced hulls. Grappling hooks pinned vessels together. And thousands of men threw themselves into mortal combat. In the center, Don Juan's galley collided directly with Ali Pasha's galley. It was as if fate itself had arranged this duel between the two supreme commanders. What followed was one of the fiercest battles ever recorded. Ottoman janissaries faced Spanish tercios, the most feared infantry in Europe. Arquebus fired at point-blank range. Scimitars clashed against swords. Men fought and died in such cramped quarters that the dead remained standing, supported by surrounding bodies. Don Juan fought personally, his sword stained with blood, inspiring his men by example. For 3 hours, the battle lurched back and forth. The Ottomans briefly captured the forecastle of Don Juan's galley. For terrifying moments, it seemed he might be captured or killed. But reinforcements arrived from neighboring galleys, and Christians regained lost ground. On the wings, equally fierce battles raged. On the northern wing, Barbarigo led his Venetians against Mem Sirocco. The Venetians fought with particular fury, remembering Cyprus and Bragadin's fate. Barbarigo was wounded early. An arrow pierced his eye, but he refused to leave the deck, continuing to command while bleeding profusely. Eventually, the Venetian wing began gaining the upper hand. Ottoman galleys, surprised by resistance intensity, began to retreat. On the southern wing, however, the situation was different. Ulik Ali demonstrated why he was considered one of the Mediterranean's most cunning commanders. Realizing the frontal attack was failing, he executed a daring flanking maneuver. His galleys circled the southern end of the Christian line, threatening to envelop the entire formation. Giovanni Andrea Doria was forced to extend his line to avoid being flanked, creating dangerous gaps. Ulik Ali exploited these gaps ruthlessly. His galleys penetrated the Christian line, causing chaos. He captured the flagship of the Order of Malta, killed its commander, and tore down the order's standard as a trophy. For a moment, it seemed the Christian southern flank might collapse completely. But Don Juan had maintained a reserve behind the main line. When danger on the southern wing became apparent, he sent this reserve, commanded by Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, to counterattack with devastating force, pushing Ulik Ali back and restoring the Christian line. In the center, the battle on the Real finally reached its climax. Ali Pasha, fighting personally on his galley's bow, was struck by an arquebus shot. He fell mortally wounded. Christian soldiers rushed him, and within moments his head was severed and raised on a spear. A scream of horror ran through the Ottoman fleet when they saw their dead commander. Conversely, Christians let out a roar of triumph that seemed to make the waters tremble. Ali Pasha's death marked the decisive turning point. The Sultan's standard, which had flown proudly from his galley's mast, was torn down and replaced by the Holy League's banner. This symbolic act had a devastating psychological effect. Ottoman galleys that had been fighting fiercely moments before began to waver. Commanders who had pressed forward confidently began considering retreat. And then the tide of battle turned decisively. The Ottoman formation began to disintegrate completely. What followed was more execution than battle. Ottoman galleys attempted to flee, but many were so entangled with Christian vessels that escape was impossible. Others managed to break free, but found nowhere to go. The bay was surrounded on 3 sides by land, and the Christian fleet blocked the only exit to open sea. Ottoman galleys were hunted down and destroyed one by one. Some ran aground on the coast in desperate attempts to allow crews to escape by land. Others were surrounded and forced to surrender after brief but fierce fighting. The sea ran red with blood. The surface was covered with wreckage, bodies, and desperate men trying to swim to safety. By late afternoon, the Battle of Lepanto was essentially over. Of the nearly 300 galleys Ali Pasha had commanded that morning, more than 200 had been destroyed or captured. Some 30,000 Ottomans were dead, another 8,000 captured. Most significantly, 15,000 Christians who had been slaves on Ottoman galleys were freed, many chained to the oars for years or even decades. Christian losses, though significant, were much smaller. Some 8,000 dead and perhaps twice that number wounded. 13 galleys lost. It was a crushing victory by any measure. The invincibility of the Ottoman fleet, which had been an article of faith for generations, had been decisively shattered in a single afternoon. As the sun set over the Gulf of Patras, illuminating the floating wreckage with golden and red light, Don Juan toured the battlefield. He visited the wounded, comforted the dying, and thanked the survivors. The magnitude of what had been achieved was becoming apparent. This wasn't just another naval victory. It was a historic turning point. The secret weapon that had been so crucial to this victory was now clear to all. It wasn't just the galiasses themselves, though their importance couldn't be denied. It was the revolutionary concept they represented, the power of naval artillery as a decisive weapon, not merely as support for boarding tactics. The 6 Venetian galiasses had fundamentally changed the battle's dynamics from the opening minutes. Their concentrated fire had destroyed or damaged dozens of Ottoman galleys before they could even engage in close combat. More importantly, they had broken the psychological momentum of the Ottoman attack. Turkish commanders, accustomed to charging toward enemy lines, found themselves sailing through fields of destruction before even reaching their targets. This initial disruption created the hesitation and confusion that allowed the Christian fleet to gain crucial advantage. But the story of Lepanto's secret weapon goes beyond the galiasses themselves. It was about the broader transformation of naval warfare taking place at that historical moment. For centuries, maritime combat in the Mediterranean had been essentially an extension of land warfare, ships serving as transport platforms for soldiers who then fought in close combat. The true innovation at Lepanto was recognizing that the ship itself, armed with powerful artillery, could be the decisive weapon. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The Venetians had experimented with naval artillery for decades, trying different configurations, calibers, and firing platform arrangements. The galiasses that fought at Lepanto represented generations of technical refinement and strategic thinking. A galleass crew was fundamentally different from a traditional galleys. While a galley required hundreds of oarsmen but relatively few gunners, a galleass reversed this ratio. It required trained gunners capable of operating complex cannons under chaotic combat conditions. It required officers who understood ballistics, range, ammunition types, and reload times. It was a new kind of naval warfare requiring a new kind of sailor. The Ottomans, for all their military prowess, had been slower to adopt these innovations. Their naval tradition was deeply rooted in galley tactics, and these tactics had worked magnificently for generations. Why change a winning formula? This reluctance to innovate, this reliance on time-tested methods, ultimately cost them dearly at Lepanto. In the weeks after the battle, as the Holy League fleet regrouped and repaired, the victory's magnitude began to sink in. Messengers raced across Europe bearing news that seemed too good to be true. The invincible Ottoman fleet had been annihilated. The Islamic advance in the Mediterranean had been halted. Christendom had won its greatest naval victory in generations. The celebration was explosive. Church bells rang in every Christian city. Processions of thanksgiving filled the streets. Pope Pius V, who had worked so tirelessly to forge the Holy League, fell to his knees in prayer upon receiving the news. He established October 7th as the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary in commemoration. In Venice, celebration lasted for days with fireworks lighting the night sky and wine flowing freely in the squares. Don Juan of Austria instantly became Europe's most celebrated hero. At 24, He had commanded the greatest naval victory of the century. Poets composed verses in his praise. Artists painted his portrait. He seemed destined for even greater things. But history took a different course than expected. The Holy League, forged with such effort before the battle, began disintegrating almost immediately afterward. Old rivalries between Venice and Spain resurfaced. Each power had its own priorities and agendas. Venice, exhausted by war and eager to regain trade routes, soon negotiated separate peace with the Ottomans. Spain, increasingly concerned about Dutch rebellions and English tensions, redirected resources elsewhere. Don Juan never had the opportunity to capitalize on his victory. He was sent to rule the Spanish Netherlands, where he fought Dutch rebels in a frustrating, endless war. He died in 1578, at age 33 of typhoid fever in a cold military tent, far from Lepanto's glory, and the Ottomans demonstrated remarkable resilience. The Grand Vizier famously said, "You Christians have burned our beard, but it will grow back stronger. We have cut off your arm, and it will never grow back." He referred to the loss of Cyprus, which remained in Ottoman hands. There was truth in his words. In less than a year, Istanbul's arsenals had built a new fleet of over 200 galleys. Yet something fundamental had changed. The Ottoman aura of invincibility had been shattered. It had been proven they could be defeated, that their tactics could be overcome, that their empire was not manifest destiny. This psychological shift was perhaps as important as the military victory itself. The Christian powers regained confidence. The panic that had gripped coastal cities for generations began to subside. Most significantly, Lepanto marked the end of Ottoman expansion in the western Mediterranean. Although they held Cyprus and remained powerful for centuries, they never again seriously attempted to invade Italy or threaten Western Christendom's heartland. Their attention gradually turned to other frontiers: the Balkans, Persia, the Caucasus. The galiasses had an interesting fate. They represented the future of naval warfare, but a future that would take decades to fully realize. They were a transitional solution, more powerful than traditional galleys, but still partially reliant on oars for maneuver. They foreshadowed the ships of the line of the 18th century, frigates and warships powered entirely by sail and armed with banks of cannons. But this complete transformation would take generations. In the short term, traditional galleys continued to dominate the Mediterranean for another century. Galiasses were expensive to build and maintain, required specialized crews, and were less versatile than ordinary galleys. So while their contribution at Lepanto was crucial, they didn't immediately replace existing fleets. Instead, they served as a portent, an indication of future direction. The true revolution in naval warfare would come with line-of-battle tactics, where heavily armed sailing ships sailed in parallel formations, exchanging artillery salvos until one side was destroyed. This was the warfare Nelson would master at Trafalgar more than 2 centuries later. But the seeds of this revolution were sown at Lepanto, where for the first time, naval artillery's power was decisively demonstrated. There are profound lessons in Lepanto's story that resonate through centuries. The first is about technological innovation's power. The Ottomans had numerical superiority, a winning tradition, and confidence born of decades of victories. But faced with a new technology they hadn't anticipated and for which they were unprepared, their advantage evaporated. The galiasses changed the game's rules in ways the Ottomans couldn't adapt to quickly enough. The second lesson concerns unity's importance in the face of existential threat. The Holy League was an unlikely alliance of states that were normally rivals or even enemies. But in the face of Ottoman threat, differences were temporarily set aside. This unity, so difficult to achieve and fragile to maintain, was crucial to victory. The third lesson is about leadership. Don Juan was only 24, relatively inexperienced in naval warfare, and commanded admirals much older than himself. But he possessed charisma, courage, and the ability to inspire men to give their best. His decision to place galiasses at the formation's forefront, though controversial, proved brilliant. Good leadership can multiply any force's effectiveness. The fourth lesson concerns unintended consequences. Lepanto was hailed as a crushing victory that would change history's course. And in a sense it did, but not as contemporaries expected. It didn't lead to Constantinople's reconquest. It didn't destroy Ottoman power. It didn't unify Christendom permanently. Instead, its consequences were more subtle and long-term. A shift in power's psychological balance, an acceleration in naval innovation, a precedent for European cooperation against common threats. Miguel de Cervantes, the young soldier who fought at Lepanto despite illness, would later write about the battle with pride. He called it the highest occasion the ages have seen. For him and thousands who fought there, it was the defining moment of their lives. They had been present at a turning point in history. And indeed, there is something epic about Lepanto that transcends the battle itself. It was the last great galley engagement in the Mediterranean, the end of an era stretching back to ancient times. The tactics Themistocles used as Salamis, the Romans used against Carthage, the Byzantines used against the Arabs, all culminated and ended at Lepanto. After that, a new era of naval warfare would dawn. The secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman Navy at Lepanto wasn't just 6 Venetian galiasses, though their contribution was crucial. It was the idea they represented. That warfare was changing, that artillery and technology were becoming more important than brute courage and traditional tactics, that the future belonged to those who could innovate faster than their enemies. This lesson would resonate through following centuries. When the Spanish faced the English Armada in 1588, the English had learned Lepanto's lessons better. When Nelson defeated Franco-Spanish fleets at Trafalgar in 1805, he was using principles dating back to Lepanto. When steam-powered warships replaced sailing ships, when torpedoes and submarines revolutionized naval warfare, when aircraft carriers became decisive in World War II. Each of these revolutions echoed the fundamental principle demonstrated at Lepanto. Technological innovation can overcome numerical and traditional advantages. Today, more than 450 years after Lepanto, we live in a world shaped in part by that distant confrontation. The balance between Europe and the Ottoman Empire that emerged influenced centuries of subsequent history. European confidence restored by victory contributed to the age of exploration and subsequent European world domination. The Ottomans, though they remained powerful for centuries, never again seriously threatened Western Europe. The very galleys and galiasses that fought at Lepanto have long since decayed to dust. The men who crewed them are centuries dead. The empires they fought for have vanished or transformed beyond recognition. But Lepanto's fundamental lesson remains relevant. Traditional advantages can be overcome by innovation. Enemies that seem invincible can be defeated. Technological changes can shift power's balance faster than anyone anticipates. And in moments of existential crisis, even bitter rivals can find ways to cooperate for mutual benefit. Thank you for watching History Files. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Battle of Lepanto and the secret weapon that changed naval warfare forever, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. The galiasses of Lepanto teach us that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that the weapons of tomorrow can defeat the invincible armies of today, that courage, leadership, and technological vision can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Check out our other documentaries on forgotten battles that changed the world, including the Black Prince's brutal campaigns, the Battle of Falkirk, and Granada's fall in 1492. Remember, history isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding why it still matters today. The lessons of Lepanto echo in every technological revolution, every moment when innovation defeats tradition, every time the future overcomes the past. Until next time, keep exploring the files of history.